My brothers and sisters, it's good to be back here with you again. The pastor at my home parish, he had some vacation. He went to go see his niece get married, and so I went off back there. I went back home, which was great, but it reminded me a lot of deployment. It's always good to go home and see your family when you're deployed in the Army, but you know that your boys are still back down range on the outpost, and you can't honestly wait to get back to them and be with them. And so here I am again with you. Now, as for the gospel, again, I love this gospel. It's massive. You could ponder it for hours. We're not going to do that. But there's a lot of, aren't you lucky? But there's so much good in here, and it ties in so well to the first two readings. But what struck me when I took it to prayer, there was one line jumped out at me. The angels, they come to the master after the bad seed's been sown, these weeds, and they say, "Didn't you sow good seed? How did this happen?" And the master, God, looks at them, his angels, and he says, "An enemy has done this." And too often in life, we forget we have an enemy. In fact, that enemy works to convince us we have lots of enemies aside from himself. He says, your neighbor is your enemy. He says, that other country over there, that's full of your enemies. This politician, he's bad. There's only one who's truly your enemy in this life, and that is the devil. And he works hard to split us up and turn us against each other and say, there's your enemy. There he is, when it's him who's pulling the strings. You don't have any enemies in this life. You might have confused people who can do you harm. But inside of every great sinner, there is the potential for a great saint, and vice versa. And that is the meaning of this reading. That's sort of why you can't tell the weeds and the wheat apart. In fact, the angels, the lowest angel in the kingdom of heaven, who's, by the way, the guardian angel, there are many different choirs, but the lowest angel is smarter than the smartest man who ever lived or ever will live. Angels are just intellect and will, and they can't tell apart who is saved and who isn't. They can't read the master's plan to its fullest. They have to trust him just like we have to trust him. And what does God say? He says, you're going to let the bad grow up with the good. Because if you pull one out, one, you might get it wrong, and two, somehow it's strengthening the good. And nothing is wasted. That's the interesting thing here. He doesn't say, and these weeds are good for nothing. He says, gather them up for burning. Nothing escapes the Lord's plan. The enemy would like to have you think that he is on equal footing. But when does the enemy come to do his dirty work? He does it at night. And he's always trying to hide himself from us. Because he knows if he's exposed, he'd be run off. And that's why he does all his dirty work in the darkness. And how does he play? Again, you can see this. And it's our job to call to mind, see how the enemy is working us. Because he never gets tired. He doesn't sleep. Thank God we have our own angels. But in this time of pandemic, every crisis is opportunity. And that works on for both sides, the good and the bad. And so I look at masks. And it doesn't matter how you shake out on it. Everyone has an opinion. But how does the devil play us with that? He divides. The very name Diabolos, Latin, means to rend, to split apart. And he says, to one, he might say, whose opinion goes a certain way, look at that sheep over there. Look at these sheep all wearing masks. Don't you feel superior not wearing one? And to the other, he might say, look at this man who's endangering other people recklessly. What a sinner. What a cruel person. I wonder how he sleeps at night. And it doesn't matter where you are, brothers and sisters. The devil is working to work you on any way, because his goal is to separate you from Jesus Christ. And how does he do that? Don't love your brother. That's his message. But it's a great opportunity, because if you see the temptation, you have a chance to triumph over it. You turn it over to Jesus Christ, and you say, I love you more than my own pride. And I die to myself. And to this petty little desire to say, oh, I'm a little bit better than this guy over here, or I can be a little angry with this person over here without knowing them. Don't judge your brother. Only God judges. That's the first reading. God in his might, he instills justice. If you would be like him, you must make yourself humble, as he does when he comes to you here on this altar in a little host. The God of all power shrinks himself down, and he's so merciful to us. The God of all power, infinite kindness, infinite forgiveness. And again, why? Because we could be weeds or we could be wheat. And he so desperately wants us to be wheat. And you see this in the saints. St. Augustine is a good example of this. You know, he started out, he was brilliant, but he had a live-in girlfriend, he had a child out of wedlock, he joined a cult, worried his mother's sick. What happens? If the angel had struck him down, we would have never had the great theologian who gave us so much of our theology, so much of our understanding of God. But there's even better example if we're talking about the enemy in particular. Have any of you ever heard of a man named Bartolo Longo? And it's a rhetorical question, don't raise your hand. But he was an Italian, lived in the 1870s, 1880s, died in the 1920s. And very smart guy, very funny, but grew up Catholic, but then fell away from the faith, said this probably isn't real. This is probably just old wives' tales. But he wanted something. He wanted truth and he wanted power. And he encountered seances, and he encountered the Ouija board, and he encountered the occult, and he said, here's power. And he dove in head first. And before you knew it, he was a satanic priest, doing all kinds of terrible rituals and things like that. And then he started to hear voices that weren't his. And he fell into depression and desires of suicide. And he said, and it clicked suddenly. He had a friend who told him as much. And he said, if this is all real, if the enemy is real, surely God is too, and I'm on the wrong side of this. And he turned himself back over to a priest. He went through something like a month-long exorcism, went to confession, and then he came to this altar, just as we all come to this altar, repentant sinners. And he turned his life around. He began to preach the rosary. He began to say, this is what pulls us out. It's the lasso Our Lady throws around us and our friends and our family and drags us up here and says, come to see my son. Come grow in strength and love and become a saint. Come grown in the Spirit, as the second reading says. Don't be united. There's only two ways. You can be united to the enemy or you can be united to your God. There will be no third way, my brothers and sisters. There is the end of the age. And when you unite yourself to him, you begin to pray in such a way that you bear great fruit. And suddenly you become the instrument of his divine will, and you stand a chance of converting the weeds into wheat. And what a great gift that is, because sometimes those who we thought were the greatest sinners become the greatest saints, like Blessed Bartolo. It's a great gift, what God gives us, being Christian, being Catholic, being able to celebrate the sacraments. My brothers and sisters, let the person who has ears, let them hear. God bless you this morning.